Croft Lab, and Paul Moorcroft has been involved for many years in doing modeling work and also working with other assessments at a regional scale. Alex, thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. I know it's almost 5 o'clock, so I'll try to be quick and more formally out of the So as was said, I'm a postdoc at Paul Moorcroft's lab, and this study has been helped on a few other people, Steve Lawson, Crystal Schaff at BU. So what we're trying to do is to estimate the forest structure and composition using remote sensing techniques, airborne remote sensing. Some introductory slides. As we all know, the global temperature is warming, atmospheric CO2 concentration is increasing, both as a global and in terms of regional temperatures. As you can see here, in the next 50-100 years, the temperature increase may range from 3 to 7 degrees. And various terrestrial advisory models have attempted to predict the long-term response of these terrestrial ecosystems to a changing climate with varying degrees of success, especially from today 2000 or so onwards, with ranges between large carbon uptakes and large sinks and sources. So these have been okay, but they're largely untested for the future state of the dynamics of these ecosystems. The model that we're using has sort of a different approach to some of these other IPCC models, in that it has a formal approach to scaling vegetation dynamics. I'm not going to go through this diagram in detail, but it's just that we include a growth and mortality dynamics as well as competition of nutrients at the individual tree level rather than at the aggregated patch level. And so there are a couple of important benefits using this model, is that because of this underlying heterogeneity, they can have potentially a more realistic, longer-term predictions in the vegetation dynamics. We also have functionally diverse ecosystems, and we can use empirical measurements to initialize the model in order to improve and constrain the model. And this last part is important because there's been a recent study by David Medvedev, who's now in Princeton, where he initialized hardwood forests with ground-based measurements, 40 or so 40 Walsey plots around the EMS and chemical towers. And he used it to constrain or optimize our model for the 10-year prediction, so for the short term. But even after optimizing, there were some discrepancies between the carbon fluxes that were optimized and the observations. So why is this? So there are a couple of sources of error in all models, but also in terrestrial advisory models. And the first and foremost is the process error. So this is about the errors arising from the inaccuracies in the equations within the models, the subroutines and parameters, or the parameters are estimated. Just like Adrian said before, a lot of assumptions are made in models. Second error is the forcing error. So that's trying to drive the model with meteorological forcing, and there could be inaccuracies spanning from that. But finally, there's the initialization error. So it's error in the initial ecosystem state, at the beginning of your simulation. So that's the final point is what we've tried to address using remote sensing, and we've hypothesized and we've tried to analyze the potential of LiDAR, which is an active remote sensing technique, with AVRIS, which is an optical or hyperspectral technique, in providing information on the forest structure and composition. And using that to initialize the biosphere model or the NBN2 model, and by doing so constrains predictions of carbon fluxes. So just a couple of the sections I'm going to talk about briefly: the LiDAR-derived forest structure, the AVRIS, and using it to derive forest composition. By forest composition, I mean plant functional types, not individual species, but an aggregate of species adhering to certain functional or functions. Thirdly, I'm going to initialize this using our model, and lastly, I did this at three different areas of the Prospect Hill tract and Harbor Forest, three main flex towers: EMS, Hemlock, and Prospect Hill. So firstly, for the LiDAR-derived forest structure, a lot of work has been done on obtaining single metrics from LiDAR. And this is just a canopy, the top of the LiDAR waveform, so the top of each patch, the maximum height, map. There's also been work trying to interpolate or get regressions of the LiDAR waveform with biomass, so they can try to estimate biomass with LiDAR as well as with other activations like radar. So rather than just using one metric from LiDAR, can we use or take advantage of the whole waveform? This is an example of what a LiDAR waveform looks like for a potential stand or a forest stand. So it's in the most LiDAR instruments in the near infrared, so it reflects off most of the foliage around the park. So what we try to do is to model LiDAR signals, or model this active remote sensing technique, so that we can have more control about the input parameters. And if we have more control about these input parameters, then we can take out certain parameters that we need for the structure of the model, to define structure within the model. So a couple of the main ones are tree density, variations in tree heights, so that you can create a distribution of heights within that wall, so within each individual patch, and relate that to its tree density. There are also a couple of optical properties that go into this model developed by Neumeister in 2001. So it's called the geometric and optical radial transfer model. And if you model that signal according to some input parameters, you can compare it to the actual remote sensing signal, and then you can reduce the estimate of some of your initial parameters if you iteratively compare it to the signal. And these are some of the resulting fits of the GORT model to the LiDAR signal. This is just 4 cases where we have a single unimodal canopy, a bimodal canopy with a strong overstory, a bimodal canopy with a limited overstory, and then a lower density, lower canopy forest. Secondly, we wanted to consider the composition of the plant functional types. And traditionally, plant functional types have come from various products like the Modus IGBP product, which is at 500 meters, or the NLCD, which is much higher resolution. It's about 1 arc second, which is 30 meters. But this only gives you, this is limited for a model for 2 reasons. Firstly, it just gives you 1 plant functional type per pixel. And secondly, the plant functional types are too coarse for consideration of our model. They're just deciduous, evergreen, or needle leaf evergreen, broadleaf evergreen, and mixed. So what I tried to do is use AVERIS, which is a hyperspectral instrument, which has about 224 bands from the ultraviolet to mid-infrared, or about 2,000 nanometers. So just an example of an image at Harvard Forest in the near-infrared with the 3 flux towers overlaid on it. So what we tried to do was use this multiple n-member spectral picture analysis technique developed at JPL to try to separate individual pixels into 5 plant functional types. So these 5 plant functional types are two conifers. So we had early successional conifers, which we define as white pine, red pine, and Harvard forest. Late successional conifers, which are mainly hemlocks, and then early mid and late successional hardwoods, which are birches, and then mid successional red oaks and red maples, and then late successional things like beeches. So if you define those, we find pixels that have a seemingly pure concentration of one of those plant functional types. You can use that to begin to separate other pixels that you cannot, you can extrapolate to other pixels. So these are resulting plant functional classifications using this multiple n-member algorithm, circulation analysis algorithm. And you get decent comparisons between the forest imagery and the calculated plant functional types. I mean, the R-squares are not incredible. You get a decently good correlation between the early late conifers and for mid-successional hardwoods, which are oaks, maybe maples, but not so much for the early and late hardwoods, but not so much for the early and late hardwoods. Just because in the plots that we had, we never had a dominance of beech or birch. Sometimes they were in the understory, but never really in the overstory. So we tried to define that as best we could, but there weren't any significant correlation between that. Just briefly, we also tried to use an alternate approach for the classification, and that was just trying to to define plant functional types using foliar nitrogen and lignin, which is from a study done here by Martin and Aber in the late 1990s. This is what the classification looks like across this cross-particular tract. I think we'll rename it, but you can see that the dominant plant functional type is the mid-successional hardwood, with a good presence of these pines and hemlocks. Thankfully, there's a good band of hemlocks around where the hemlock tower is. So that's encouraging. It's not great. This is like initial study. As you can see, the early successional hardwoods and late successional hardwoods, very, very low concentrations, just because we couldn't really define them in our plots, in our algorithm. But the resulting aggregated tree size distributions look good. So this is the ground-based, what the ground-based distribution of trunk sizes looks like at the 40 EMS plots. This is just a visualization of the forest, and then this is what you get from the average-derived composition overlaid on the LiDAR-derived structure. So you get a decently comparable mean and variance of that distribution. With a comparable the total basal area of those plots, and also you get a good amount of mid-successional hardwoods, which is also compared to the ground measurements, and an equal distribution, an equal split between the hemlocks and the pines. The LPH site slightly less well. They did slightly less well than the previous one. We had a lower distribution, a lower density of trees. But again, it predicted the mid-successional hardwood dominance. The hemlock site, again, a good mean and variance of the structure with a comparable total basal area, and the composition correctly identified hemlocks and pines, although it didn't sort of estimate this skewed distribution of the pines. All three sites together now. The next couple of slides are about using these distributions to initialize the model. So first I'm going to present the carbon, the seasonal carbon fluxes. The first one is for EMS, LPH, and hemlock. The ground-based is in blue. The remote sensing basic initialization is in red, with very good agreement between both of those for all the plots. There's decent comparison between the observed flux tower measurements, maybe more so for the hemlock, slightly less so for the EMS. But for our purpose, the ground-based and the remote sensing basic initializations were almost on par. Similar story for the GPP. You get a high, because of the dominance of deciduous forests, both in these, you get a much larger productivity in the summer months, and almost zero in the winter, while there's a more evenly distributed productivity for the conifer site. And because of the lower distribution in the LPH, you get a lower productivity as well. What we also want to do finally, next couple of 3 slides, I think first, is try to do what would have been done before this, which is people would initialize the model from bare ground, so run a 300-year simulation with a plant functional type from Modis or from some other technique, and then run into equilibrium, and then get a carbon flux and say this is we've tried this is the information that we can get out of it. So what I've shown here is that you can have you can initialize, you can do these potential vegetation runs with early hardwoods, mid hardwoods, and for the EMS case, you could say that these are comparable to the observations and to remote sensing and ground-based initialization of the model. But when you get to the LPH, which has a lower density because it's been disturbed in the past 50 or 60 years, you see that it's not comparable. Running a potential vegetation model is not representative of that specific site because it's been disturbed. So getting the actual state of the above ground ecosystem is more appropriate. For the hemlock site, actually the lake conifers seem to be more similar to the observations, but our 2 initializations from ground and remote sensing are also reasonably close. But we can say that this is not a problem with our initialization method, it's a problem with our model. So as I said in the beginning, we have the process error. So now that we've reduced the initialization error, there must be something within the process of the model that needs to be dealt with, optimized, constrained. And in this case, for the GPP, it probably is something within the photosynthesis model, sort of submodel. This is the ecosystem respiration. Ecosystem respiration seems to be slightly more off. Again, this might be a problem with the process error of the model. So the decomposition model, I'm sure there could be some connecting point with some of the previous talks. Decomposition model may not be constrained appropriately, but nevertheless, it shows that the potential vegetation runs are not appropriate or not similar to what is observed at the ground or from remote sensing. And then these are the NEP, here are the averages. And it's just to show here that none of these sites, or especially these two sites, are nowhere near equilibrium. Potentially, if you move that line backwards, maybe these are at the 50 or 100-year mark. The LKH is at 50 years since this last disturbance, and then the hemlock probably is maybe at 150 years, 200 years since last disturbance. But it's just to show that none of these are at equilibrium, and it's much more representative to try to initialize these from an actual above ground ecosystem state. So in summary, the hyperspectral and the LiDAR have been used to provide spatially extensive measurements of fine-scale forest structure and composition. These estimates have been used to initialize the model and to constrain the predictions of carbon fluxes. And the future with satellites like HiSphere, which is a hyperspectral satellite, and ISAT-2, which is a new satellite with the more advanced class satellite, could use these to try to pave the way for more accurate regional and global scale carbon cycle simulations that are critical for predicting how the Earth system will change in the future.
Hey, thanks. That was both interesting and short. Question? Aaron?
So I am fascinated by the fact that your models run to equilibrium and don't agree, especially level observation. That Bill Keaton's models assume a landscape equilibrium carbon storage, which probably equally would not agree with observation. And the Harvard, we've got 100 years of Harvard forest data about forest growth dynamics disturbance that suggests that these forests are never in equilibrium. Correct. So why would we look for landscape equilibrium carbon storage or run models to equilibrium and analyze?
Well,
I'm just curious.
I think where it would apply more would be to try to run it at a site which is an old growth forest. So let's say go to the tropics, that's an old growth forest. You try to calibrate your model to that forest, and then you can better predict changes to.
Are old growth forests in equilibrium?
Potentially not, because increasing carbon and nitrogen. Yes, I know.
No.
I understand.
Join this conversation.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So just to be clear, the equilibrium storage condition just referred to stands being harvested. So if we have multiple stands that are harvested over time and space, and their harvesting schedule is staggered, then you're looking at how much storage those stands have at any one point in time. That was the equilibrium.
But for example, you assume that every 30 years it comes back
As a result of
the harvest description.
Right.
I suspect there's no evidence for that.
Well, no. Oh, go ahead.
Well, you're thinking about CO2 fertilization effects and changes in growth rates.
Anything that any
Sustained.
you cut down a forest and 30 years later it is not back to, or wherever it is that you again in the same amount of time, it's not back to where you think it should be, or it's further back. Why? It's just those things are going to go like this.
Maybe near equilibrium would be somewhere with it's carbon. Defining something that's carbon neutral maybe what it is.
Thanks. You generated it's marvelous, and this is what this is all about. If you are one of the people who is invited for dinner because you are a graduate student or a postdoc involved in the research here, listen to this message.